Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Wednesday, January 7th, so Merry Christmas to all Eastern Orthodox Christians out there. Um,
Right. Yeah, not all of them.
the
It's those
Greeks,
that celebrate. Yeah, the Greeks, for example, are on the Gregorian calendar. Those who are on the Julian calendar, like the Russian Orthodox Church. That's
right.
right. It's a Merry Christmas. Yeah, for all of us.
Speaking of Russians, did you just see the news that the U.S. military seized a Russian oil tanker?
Yes, I did. It was that tanker that we were talking about earlier, I believe. Remember that the Coast Guard tried to seize in the Caribbean and turned around and started steaming across the Atlantic. This is somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic. Um, and just a couple of days ago, the the tanker re-registered under Russia and actually painted a Russian flag on its hull. But that I guess the hopes that would create second thoughts on the part of the Americans. But this Coast Guard vessel followed it well out into the Atlantic, and then I think there was some other aircraft that came out, and this was the ship was boarded and seized. Now it's very strange. They're claiming that it stole American oil. I guess anybody who buys oil in Venezuela is stealing American oil now. But my understanding is that it's empty. It actually did not reach the port. It turned around before arriving in Venezuela. So I don't even know what they're going to do with it. But it is it's another escalation. It's another brazen attack on free shipping, on maritime commerce. And it is another, insult and kind of a gauntlet thrown down in the direction of Russia.
How big of an escalation do you think this is?
Well, it's just part of a series of these attacks and seizures of ships. Some of them, especially Russia-linked ones, but Chinese as well. Again, 75% of the oil that's exported from Venezuela is going to China. So, some of this affects China even more than it does Russia, potentially anyway. So,
Have we seized Russian ships before? Is this the first
I don't
Russian
know
ship?
that I don't think we've actually seized a ship that's operating under a Russian flag. I don't think that has happened. No.
But we
So
have
it is
seized Chinese ships, right?
yeah. Okay. They were not ships that were flying the Chinese flag, but they were ships that were, owned by a Chinese company or were carrying oil to China. We'll just call them, China linked ships, if we want to put it that way.
But this one here, this was full Russian. They painted a Russian flag on the whole. It was
Yeah.
heading to Russia. And
Yeah, apparently. That's right. There were these reports that the Russians had sent, some naval vessels, including a submarine out there. Apparently that's not true. Those were rumors that the Russians never confirmed, and then the Americans said no, there weren't any Russian naval vessels in the vicinity.
is this like an act of war? I mean, is this? Where do you see this going?
It's getting close. Yeah, I mean it's very dangerous. This is something. Well, one thing, because it does. It is an act of war, I'd have to say, right? Attacking the shipping of an adversary in this manner. And now it's become increasingly brazen again with this particular seizure. There was maybe this plausible deniability, not really, that the Ukrainians were doing it, but then, it was later revealed in the New York Times that the CIA was heavily involved in all that, which is kind of what we suspected all along. But there's no deniability here. And then, okay, I think it could be regarded as an act of war. Maybe it falls a little short of that, but it's taking us up to the line of that. And then also it strikes at core economic interests of both of these countries, both China and Russia. And it's something that I think they have to respond to. We saw that Putin really did respond to the attacks on shipping in the Black Sea. And he responded very forcefully. Odessa is basically shut down. The ports there in Odessa, close to Odessa, are basically shut down. But I heard that again today there was another attack on a Russia-linked tanker off the coast of Senegal. I don't think it did any significant damage, but it's just something that's ongoing. It seems like the Ukrainians aren't going to let this go, or Ukrainians being prodded by the Americans, or what? I don't know. I think, again, it's hard to believe that the Americans or MI6 is not involved when they're talking about an attack off the coast of Senegal.
How should countries like China and Russia respond to this?
Yeah, I think they just have to. It's a very dangerous situation because, part of it is say, my God, let's not have World War III. But the thing is, they can't let this continue because, again, it's these are core economic interests, and they have to respond forcefully, right? But then you have this president that thinks he's a god emperor, and you don't know how he's going to respond to that. This is something. Now, we did see, like in the case of China, when China responded forcefully in the trade war, it's a little different. It's trade. It's not, we're not talking about naval vessels and drones and so forth. It's not military. But when they responded forcefully, the Americans backed down. Trump backed down. He would never admit it, but obviously he did. It's harder for him to back down, I think, when you're dealing with something like this. This is just sort of much more concrete, visual. It's the sort of thing. And the guy has a huge ego, and it's wrapped up in this larger belief. This sacred idea of American supremacy. And if you attack it directly, I don't know how you respond. But it almost seems like they have to, right? I mean, the Americans are driving them into a corner.
So what do you think they will do? They'll escort these ships, give them, some basic. Are these oil tankers will start having man pads themselves to shoot at helicopters? What do you expect? I mean,
yeah, I don't know. I'll just be honest. I don't know.
I think it has to be.
Yeah, maybe. Those are both are possibilities. Or they can start seizing, ships that are vital to, vital to America in one way or another. That's the way that the Iranians have dealt with this in the past. The Iranians have been dealing with these kind of things much longer than the Russians and the Chinese, and they've done, taken the tit for tat route, and it seems to work. In the end, when they release, their tanker, when the Americans release the Iranians' tanker.
Well, the country that seems to have the most leverage is China. We talked about this extensively when the whole rare earth minerals was coming up and how they, said no more rare earth minerals to you, the United States. Then we realized how critical these resources were to the United States, to the MIC, to our high-tech industries, everything. And they basically have a monopoly on it. So why doesn't China just reinstate this, saying like, okay, well, you're stealing our resources, stealing the oil that we purchased, and now they're going and stealing Russia's oil as well. It's like, wait, no more trade with you, the United States. You can't be doing this. We're not going to give you the stuff that you need to continue. Well, why isn't that happening? Why is China so silent?
Yeah, I actually don't know. We've been wondering about that. That's something that we've been discussing. Again, why is China so silent? Actually, they just did issue a very strong denunciation of the seizure of the Russian tanker. They were quite vocal about that, and maybe that signals a change in their approach to this. They do have a lot of leverage. They used it recently, actually, vis-a-vis Japan. There's still that spat is ongoing, and they just simply declared that all dual-use products are, from here on are just no longer permitted to be exported to Japan. And then if they find a third party is re-exporting it to Japan, that third party will be sanctioned as well.
Yeah, it feels like where we are now, everything is kind of out in the open about what the U.S. is all about. Any pretense of international law or doing things for humanitarian reasons is kind of thrown out the window. And and I think it is giving it is feeding that megalomania in Trump. He just feels like, okay, this is our neighborhood and we can do what we want. We're not going to pretend that this is about international law. It's like we won't allow Russia and China to be in our hemisphere, and we have the ability to control it. We weren't able to dictate terms over in China or in Ukraine, but we can here. And so I think it feels like a win to Trump. So I feel like the more he does this type of stuff, I think it'll continue to feel like wins, and he'll continue doing this. He's going to take Greenland. He might overthrow Colombia. You'll still, seize more ships until there's going to be some type of reaction. I feel like that's the course we're on right now.
Yeah, well, I agree. I think you're right. And it is scary. I don't know. Again, the truth is that the U.S. has an advantage here in the Caribbean. It is their backyard, and these Latin American countries are really quite weak, relative to the U.S. And they're far away from both Russia and China. So it's just not clear. I don't know that Russia and China if they're going to insist on maintaining this oil trade. Again, it is important to China.
It's not that
are they
important
to
China, though, is it?
Well, no, they have alternatives. That's true.
Right.
So,
I
mean,
hear
they could do. Yeah, I think it's
small amount.
I think it's a small fraction, but I think they were helping to build it up. They had plans to expand it. Yeah, they can live without it. It's true, and obviously the Russians don't need any oil. So that may be the brutal calculation that they just made, the very cold calculation. It's just like, okay, yeah, this is terrible. This is very unjust, but there's not a whole lot we can do about it. And it doesn't actually affect our core interests. So we just need to pull back and criticize from the sidelines. Now, but, as far as like the larger issue of just the maritime commerce, that is still there. There have been, they continue to be these attacks on Russia-linked ships. There was supposedly a ship boarded in the Indian Ocean, a Chinese ship. We'll see.
Yeah, it seems like, when there's a regime change attempt, I guess it just makes sense that either it just seems to be very decisive, very quick. Although what happened in Venezuela isn't a regime change. The regime's still in there. It's something a little bit different. Right. But, what we saw in Syria and Venezuela, I think it caught a lot of people by surprise about how quick it is. But then you see other countries like Yemen, for example, that have nothing, that are able to take on the empire and actually make the empire run away. Or Iran, a regime change attempt, and then Israel starts getting hit hard. And then it's all of a sudden the U.S. has to say, like, okay, let's stop this. We don't do this anymore. So why isn't, do you think that countries in Latin America or, throughout the global South, that countries like China and Russia will start to provide material to sort of take the Yemen type approach to say, like, okay, you can fight back now because we've talked about this before, because of the advances in technology, right. It levels the playing field. And so if there's not a success like we had in Syria, or a kidnapping where you use the CIA and you bribe off half of the government and then you're able to overthrow it, it seems like it's not that easy.
Yeah, well, so what would they do? Like in the case of Venezuela, I guess.
Well, I'm just thinking drones, right. Missiles, like if the
right.
coast, if the Navy gets too close, or, I mean, really it's amazing that, the U.S. was able to do this kidnapping without anything going wrong.
Right.
It just took
right.
one successful, hit on a helicopter and the whole thing could have gone the other way.
Right. Yeah. I think like a lot of people are saying that clearly there must have been, somebody had been bought off. Somebody had issued a stand down order. And I think we got further evidence of that. There was an incident I think it was maybe yesterday or early yesterday morning. The shots fired, around the presidential palace and there was a fear that or the belief, at least for half an hour, that a coup was underway, because there was a lot of gunfire. It turned out that it was actually a drone that was spotted flying overhead. I think it was a harmless civilian drone, maybe a couple of drones, and soldiers began firing on it. And that just tells you, well, look, this was a little drone. And then immediately there was this response, but there was no response on that night that Maduro was abducted. And that just, That just
Yeah.
beggars belief. It's just,
It's clear to me that there was a stand down order, that
yeah,
they got to people at the very top that were able to tell, say everybody, don't stand down, don't do it. I think there was one man pad fired that one person was like, screw this is crazy, and he shot
yeah.
the helicopter. But everybody else, it seems like they were like, okay, I guess we got to follow orders. So it's clearly somebody's compromised at the top. I mean, and I don't know about Delcy Rodriguez. Trump came out with saying that they made a deal with Delcy Rodriguez. The U.S. and Venezuela have reached an agreement to export up to $2 billion worth of Venezuelan crude to U.S. ports. It actually doesn't sound like that much. It doesn't sound like that big of a deal. Do you think that this is
It's
Delcy
possible,
Rodriguez?
You just never know with Trump. He often claims to have made deals that were never made. He has a history of doing that, so we don't know. But it's possible. And, again, there were those reports that there were negotiations between her and apparently her brother Jorge on the one side and the Americans on the other side, through a Persian Gulf intermediary. And we don't know if that's true or not. We just don't. Yeah, it remains to be seen. We'll see. What actions, concrete actions, the current government in Venezuela takes.
Right. I mean, even if Delcy Rodriguez worked with the U.S. in some way to make this happen, there's no guarantee that she will be a willing vassal afterwards, though.
Yeah,
She's
I think
gonna
that's
have to
right. Right. We'll see. That's right. And maybe, as many people were saying, like Maduro himself was promising all kinds of things to the Americans. The one thing he wouldn't do was step down himself. And, perhaps there are people within the Venezuelan government, including Delcy Rodriguez, who said, well, look, he's just giving away everything. Maybe we'll just give away Maduro and we can actually drive a better bargain for ourselves. That maybe is what happened. Again, we'll see. By the way, it strikes me like before this abduction, we were always hearing about, Machado was going to move in there. Machado was the legitimate ruler. She won the election, so she'll be welcomed. And then Trump shot that all down and said, she's actually doesn't have much support there and is not respected, which seems to be an acknowledgement that maybe she did win the election and that it was Maduro. It just struck me that way.
Right. It's, I think she's got to be pretty upset because I think she just assumed that this was... and the crazy thing is this whole thing seemed to have been in the works for a long time. I mean, just the fact that Machado got the Nobel Peace Prize just shows that the Europeans were in on this as well. They played their part. They gave the Nobel Peace Prize
or at least at least the Norwegian committee, the Nobel Committee.
Right.
They were probably pressured. People approached them, and. Or they maybe didn't need to be pressured. The thing is, they're kind of on this. They're all on the same page. They're part of the globalist elite. So it was just very easy to convince them. Oh, this is the woman that should get the prize.
Right. And then the Europeans' failure to condemn what happened in Venezuela, I think, is also just a sign that they're still playing their part. But it's going to come back and bite them because now Trump is like, okay, well, we'll just take Greenland from you. It's like, and I think that it will happen. I don't think it necessarily will even be. It won't be like a military invasion. They will just go and just plant their flag there and say we have it. And what are they going to do?
Yeah, but there's 60,000 people live there. I mean, you could simply just buy them off. You could give each of them $100,000. That would be, $6 billion. It's just nothing for the U.S. And you have Greenland, right?
Right. Well, I mean, that's what he's talking about now, saying that we'll buy it. Do you think that could go through? I mean, obviously Denmark.
Well, obviously Denmark. To actually for a transaction to be legitimate, the other party has to agree to it, right? So if Denmark says no, and every indication so far is that they will say no, then you can't buy it. You can leave the money on the table, but that's not a transaction. Then take it, but that's just still theft, right?
Mm-hmm. So do you think he's going to take it? Everything is so crazy right now.
I know. I think so. I remember when it was first mentioned, I just thought this was some kind of joke. He's having fun with us, and then it became clear, after the second or third time that, yeah, he was quite serious about it. And now I think he feels empowered. This is the problem. He can do anything, and especially in his own hemisphere. I'm sure, dealing with the Russians and the Chinese in Eurasia is frustrating. You can't push them around. Obviously there were attempts to do that. The tariffs against China, and the various sanctions, and then the drone attacks on the oil refineries. We found out that even while he was, playing nice with the Russians, he knew that the CIA was helping, carry out these drone attacks on Russian infrastructure. But he thought it would give him leverage, but clearly it doesn't. The Russians are able to absorb the hits, which were minor, and then they have the air defense to eventually just shut it down, and they can also end up doing a lot more damage to Ukraine than the West can ever do to Russia, and with these kind of operations. So it's just frustrating for him. He just has a sense of his own impotence. But in the Western Hemisphere, yeah, he can be the God Emperor, and that's bad news for the Western Hemisphere, and
the world, right?
I mean, for the world too, right? Because again, Latin America is one thing is it's not just Venezuela, but just Latin American countries have increasingly strong and important, vital economic ties with China. The trade with China has been growing rapidly, over the last couple of decades, and increasingly China has become more important to them than the U.S. Was. The U.S. used to dominate those countries economically, not just politically, but economically. But that's just not true anymore.
I just feel like this has to end in some type of massive war, or world war, or something close to it. I'm just the amount of actions that we're taking. Just think about all the other wars, how they start off. World War I, it was a political assassination, and then look what happened. I mean, it just takes one event, and then things start to spiral out of control. And we have so many events moving right now. I can't even keep track of it. I want to talk about Iran as well, but all this other stuff keeps on coming up that I'm just like, oh my goodness, now we're seizing Russian oil tankers. The CIA admits that it's involved in these drone attacks, and then we kidnap the sitting president of a country. We just kidnap, go in there, bomb the country, kill 80 people, and then just kidnap the president and his wife. And then and then the crazy thing is, I was saying as well, that there's been so much that has changed, is that we're just very brazen about what we're doing. There's no idea that there's international law, and that we're admitting that the CIA is involved in attacks on Russia. But then with Maduro, we pretend that that we're following some legal process, that this was a law enforcement mission is what it was. Yeah. That's what it was, and that he's going to court and he's going to be indicted. And
it would be interesting. There's always a chance that the legal part of it will fail. It really depends on the integrity of this judge. Now, my understanding, he's a very old guy, he's 92 years old, and I think he was the judge that actually oversaw some of the 9/11 cases. And now I know a lot of those 9/11 families actually were in the end very upset with him, because they felt like he decided to really side with the government and keep a lot of things secret, and they wanted them to be revealed. That's my understanding. But he's a judge with a long career, and clearly at the end of his career, where really nothing's to be lost, he might just decide, well, I'm just going to do the right thing. And the thing is, like within the U.S., there, especially within the established, let's say the academic and legal elite, there are a lot of Trump haters. There are a lot of people. He would be a hero, I think, within the legal community, if he shut this down and freed Maduro. I think actually he would. The assumption that, this is just going to be a show trial is a mistake. Maybe it will be, but there is still some independence in our judiciary. Trump doesn't always get what he wants. He has suffered some reversals in the courts, and it could happen here. We'll see. I don't know. It could go either way. Again, it's just like there's always this tendency, even among fairly liberal or leftist judges, just to side with the government. But it's not a foregone conclusion that Maduro will be convicted. and that'll be an interesting part of the drama. Again, even when you have a general support for hegemony, there can be divisions, within the country over that. Just like in Israel, right? They're all Zionists. All the supporters of Israel are Zionists, but a lot of them hate Netanyahu, and so we got that ICC, warrant for his arrest. But it wasn't really a blow against Zionism. Unfortunately, it was just against Netanyahu. They wanted to have somebody else in charge of the Zionist project. And you could say the same thing. Again, it's just like, clearly the U.S. has been behaving as a hegemon, ever since the 1990s. And so there's not real opposition at all, any opposition within the establishment to the hegemonic project, to this, this notion of U.S. dominated global order. But there are a lot of people that say we don't want Trump at the top of it. He's actually bad for our project. We want somebody else. So there is a chance again. I think that this legal case, which I understand is very flimsy and seems to have been very poorly thought out and may fail.
Yeah, I mean, if it succeeds, I think it's very damaging to the idea of a rule of law here in the United States. It just shows that it's right. Just, you just go after, these are political cases,
right.
Like if you're just on the wrong side, they'll go after you. It's kind of scary. It's starting to feel more Soviet, just.
Right. Well, yeah. Again, the thing is, like, we're pointing at Trump now for a good reason. We should be blaming him. But prior to this, it was the Democrats who were starting to use the courts, as
right.
a weapon, against lawfare against Trump. So it's part of I would say, an unraveling, a very sharp decline of American, of the American Republic, of the constitutional system that we have.
Yeah, just the rule of law. One thing that was in that indictment, or that wasn't in the indictment against Maduro, was the Cartel de los Soles, which was the whole thing that they were talking about. I heard it on the news all the time, that Maduro is the head of this drug cartel, and it's not even mentioned. So it just goes to show that it doesn't exist, or if it does exist, it exists as a CIA construct.
Yeah. Well, my understanding is that it was actually a label put on just sort of an informal network in Venezuela back in the 1990s. There wasn't really an organization called Cartel de los Soles, but the CIA was working with those people. They actually oversaw a shipment of cocaine from Venezuela into the U.S., part of some operation, and they were actually told customs, let this go through. We have to, as part of our operation, trust us. And they just called these guys that they were working with Cartel de los Soles, but that organization didn't really exist. It's just an informal network, and then it just ceased to exist completely. And it became, but this phrase, or this label actually became sort of an inside joke. Like, journalists and others within Venezuela would say, he's a member of the Cartel de los Soles, which is it. Not that organization existed. It was like saying he has his hand in the till or something. He's a corrupt guy. That's just what it became. It was a figure of speech. And now, but then it was incredibly, I think it was just a couple of days ago, even Marco Rubio mentioned the Cartel de los Soles. It's like, it's almost like saying, yeah, we hear that he's got the hand in the till. We're going to find that till, man, and we're going to go get it. It's just a figure of speech. It's just, that's the level, or the depth of ineptitude and stupidity that we've reached here.
Right. But I mean, they labeled this cartel that doesn't exist as a terrorist organization, and it gives them this justification. It just shows you how they operate. They can say, this is a bad man. We'll just make up some illegal crime syndicate, and then we'll say that he's the head of it, and we'll label this crime syndicate as a terrorist organization. And then, so just you as even me, you told me, like, it doesn't really exist. And I'm like, well, it's got to exist to some extent, right? It can't be complete, but it doesn't seem like it is, or else it would be in this indictment.
Right, exactly.
It does. It's just, it's insane to me that we're able to lie so comfortably, and that because there's so much faith, residual faith in the United States and its institutions. Even I have trouble coming to terms with just how brazen we are and how
Yeah.
deceptive we are.
Right.
It's hard to imagine, but
Yeah.
it's true. It seems to be true. That just you can't trust the United States with anything it says.
Yeah, no, unfortunately, it's true. And the problem with that is that sometimes, like, it just becomes increasingly difficult to know what's true. Um, occasionally, I'm sure the U.S. government speaks the truth, right? But you just start to develop this attitude that it must be a lie. And uh, yeah, they've obviously lied in creating pretexts for other wars. This is not the first time this has happened by any means. This is the old playbook, but it just seems like it's been done with spectacular incompetence this time. It's just the lies are just so very obvious. They were somewhat convincing. I think it's like people have become, increasingly cynical over time, myself included. I remember back in, prior to in the buildup to the Iraq War, I was still, really very naive. I was not convinced by the case, I have to say, and actually stated that no, I didn't see that we had, any justification for an attack in Iraq. But I assumed that there was actually something to it, to these charges that were being made. I couldn't really believe that the whole thing was just completely fabricated. And then later I found out that it was, and that was, has led me to where I am. And I think a lot of people have gone on that same journey. We've become increasingly cynical. And now it's just like, if you believe these lies, you just got to be, just willfully stupid, because they're just so blatantly obvious. They didn't even do the homework to find out that the organization, that basically it's an inside joke now within Venezuela. It doesn't actually exist.
Well, the lies work. You say that you have to be stupid, but I think the reality is just that most people just don't really care too much about these issues, and then they just see and they just get a little. They're able to.
Right. I have to apologize. I want to say that people who believe it aren't necessarily stupid, but they're not paying attention. Let's just put it that way. And they are naive. They're trusting. They're not doing, I would say, their due diligence as citizens. You need to actually. I know we all have busy lives, but occasionally, especially if you're going to vote, you got to spend some time trying to make sense of these things. And it doesn't take a whole lot of effort to find out that this is total nonsense.
Yeah, I think so much of the American population, it's all just based on emotion. And the American people have just felt like everything's going to be decline, and there's just loss after loss. China's beating us in the economy. Russia's winning in Ukraine. It just seems like America, we need a win. And I think they're just desperate to grab onto something that they could see as a win. And then this whole Venezuela story is painted as this is a bad guy that's sending drugs into your country. They don't ever read the indictment. They don't know that the Cartel de los Soles doesn't exist, and that we went there and stopped them. And not only that, now we're getting billions of dollars worth of oil. So this is a huge win for America. America's back. We're reasserting military dominance and our economic strength here in our hemisphere. That's as far as a lot of people compute. And so I think, like I said, one of the most disappointing things for me with this is just to see the American reaction, that the majority, it seems to me like the majority of Americans, a lot of them are like, okay, yeah, Trump wasn't doing good with stuff in the Middle East or whatever, but this, hoorah, this is our backyard, and we're showing that we still
right.
got it. And it's just been very disappointing to me. But at the same time, maybe I can ask you this question. Why is it that for me, all these things that are happening in Venezuela, in the Middle East, Russia, or China, Iran, these are so important and they're so fascinating, and they have huge implications for us all. But the majority of people just don't care. Why don't people care? Why don't people? It seems like people don't. I know we have busy lives. I'm very busy outside of these conversations as well, but I can't stop thinking about it. Yeah. It's just always occupying my mind. I'm like, wow, this is the most fascinating story of our time. And most people are just like, oh my God, do you see what P. Diddy did? Or just, it's just, they don't care.
Well, maybe because you have these thrice weekly conversations with your dad.
Yeah, but we started doing these because I was interested.
Yeah. Well, I hope I planted a seed. I mean,
for sure you did. 100%.
Yeah, and I think one thing that sets us apart from a lot of American families is that we do have a lot of connections overseas and an interest in foreign countries. And I think that was part of your upbringing. It wasn't like any sort of political position was ever pounded into your head, but there was this awareness of a larger world, and you were encouraged to go out and explore it. A lot of Americans never leave the continent, or if they do, they just go on a cruise or something, and they're still in an American bubble. All of you were encouraged to learn foreign languages. I think all of that has an effect. You had your trip to Palestine, with my parents and their organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think one thing also that helped me is that I was never partisan. I've never voted in a presidential election. Part of the reason I was in China for most of that time. But even when I was here, for me, it just seems silly. It seems stupid. I kind of started realizing that you're choosing between Pepsi and Coke. People get angry, but for the most part, things don't really change, especially foreign policy wise. And so but here, so many people, they are just locked into a tribal camp. And I just find that odd. And I'm glad that I never was like that. And sometimes people will call me, based on our conversation, he's clearly a leftist, or he's clearly, hardcore right-wing fascist or something, But I think that's part of the problem, right? Is that we just we have this sports football mentality, and part of it's like, okay, when we do something like in Venezuela, it's like, this is our home team, the United States took it, so hooray. Or we hate the Democrats, so whatever the right does is okay.
Yeah,
it's a huge problem.
Yeah, well, it's always been part of human societies going way back. Unfortunately, it's just this kind of primitive tribalism. It just happened. Even in I call it a primitive tribalism, but it exists as much, or maybe even more so, in very so-called advanced, high technology societies. It's just there. You just find it everywhere. Well, maybe you don't find
China.
Yeah, I was just going to say, because that's something you pointed out. It's maybe an unfortunate consequence of the kind of political system that we have. People. The idea, of course, is that you have a real debate, and you hear different sides, and then you get to choose. And maybe some people actually do that, but it just seems like instead what you have is these different tribes forming. It's like us, the blues versus the reds, and then especially with the current social media, the media landscape, that okay, the blues have their own media, and the reds have theirs. They live within their separate bubbles, and they just and if you're within the red bubble, the way to get to your clicks is to say, what you're supposed to say and who you're supposed to attack, and then there's the your opposite number on the blue side, and it just kind of there's never actually a debate in the middle. It just becomes this increasing polarization. Yeah, I guess, it's not, I guess I made a mistake. It is a common occurrence in human societies. It's true. But it doesn't have to take the form that it's taking in our country now.
Yeah, liberal democracy just feels like a con game, because it makes you think that, like, okay, once I get my party in, that all problems will be solved. But all it creates is just this passing the buck from one side to the other, and nothing really changes. But in a system like in China, I feel like it's much more efficient, because everybody's on the same team, and when the government's not doing something right, people will be upset, and they have to fix and respond to that. It's not like there's no feedback loop within the Chinese government, that they're just like, okay, only everybody gets one bowl of rice and just sit in your factory for 15 hours a day. It's not how it works. If they implement a bad policy, there's repercussions for the officials that were behind it. And so there is an accountability mechanism built in the Chinese system, but there doesn't seem to be one in the United States. There's just no accountability for everything. Right. And we're just talking about, just saying, like, we're talking about, we're going with this whole idea of the rule of law, and that's why we had to take Venezuela. But we haven't seen anything about the Epstein files. Where are the arrests for there? The massive fraud in the United States, the Russiagate hoax, or the way we handled COVID and all this. Nobody gets prosecuted. You say you're about the rule of law, nothing happens. And then you just use it when you want to for some weird geopolitical game.
Right. Yeah. No, it becomes this partisanship, it in the end, it just becomes a distraction, right? It just said, okay, or it provides some sort of a false hope. You invest a great deal of energy in getting your team in power, and then you assume that that'll work out. It doesn't, and so then the other team takes it. It just goes back and forth. But you're right; the problems themselves never seem to be addressed.
Right. Okay. Well, let me move over to something else before I forget. I really want to talk about Iran because right now Iran.
Actually, I just had one thought about Venezuela before we go to Iran. I'll try to make it quick, but it's just that there are a lot of reports that have come out recently, or I shouldn't say reports, but rather, opinion pieces, editorials, that are saying that, okay, by Trump, by what he did, has actually made himself, is emulating Putin, or his actions are somehow similar to Putin's actions in Ukraine. There was one opinion piece that came out called the Putinization of American politics, for example, and that seems to be just sort of like just an established truth, just an obvious fact now, among those people that oppose Trump, is that, now he's become Putin. This is what we're seeing. He's behaving in the same way. And then they're declaring some kind of equivalence between the Venezuela and Ukraine. And I would say that there isn't, there just isn't. And it's actually, I think, illustrative to look at it and to contrast it. It's just that, in Ukraine, is there any kind of argument that this was a threat to national security? We've heard these obviously bogus arguments about fentanyl and whatever. And in the end, fentanyl wasn't even mentioned in the indictment. Was this part of some sort of military alliance directed from the U.S. and a military alliance that was backed by a superpower? Is there a large American community that is being suppressed and, having their language and cultural rights suppressed in Venezuela? None of these things. Actually, if you want to look for an equivalence, and sometimes people make this, but I don't think they take it far enough, is they'll say, well, stop and think. Well, like if we began, like the Russians began to move into Mexico, how would we respond? And people say, oh, yeah, we probably respond very forcefully. But just stop and think about, I think you need to actually look at it, like really imagine what the Russians are faced with. And you can use Mexico as a long border with the U.S., similar to the long border that Ukraine has with Russia. And just say that, okay, in Mexico, was, we'll just live in an alternate reality, just for argument's sake. Let's say Brazil is like a hyperpower, and they start to build up these military alliances, and it spreads north, and now the next one is going to be Mexico. They begin to flood Mexico with weapons, and they're, increasingly hostile rhetoric is coming from Brazil and from this alliance. And they said, okay, yeah, now Mexico's going to join our alliance, and then there's even talk about nuclear weapons, maybe placing those within Mexico. It has to be remembered that shortly before the launch of the SMO at the Munich Security Conference, Zelensky actually stated his desire to have nuclear weapons in Ukraine, and there was no pushback. There was, I think there were just nods in the audience. That's what it is, and the Russians saw that. But then, say that there's a large American community, like much of northern Mexico is English speaking, and now the Mexicans have declared, okay, no more English, start pushing down your statues of George Washington and so on and so forth. But even worse than that, it's just said, like, okay, this is not just something potential. In the past, there was some invasions, through Mexico, and it led to a terrible war, an invasion of the United States that led to the death of 40 million people, which would be approximately, proportionate to the 27 million that the Russians suffered. And so you just go on, and then, stop and think about that. I mean, just to get a sense of what the Russians were faced with. And if we really put ourselves in their shoes, we say, oh, we would have responded forcefully long time ago. It's actually the Russians waited for a long time and were trying to find a diplomatic solution. I mean, if you wanted to create an equivalence, that's the kind of equivalence that you create. There's just nothing. This is like Venezuela was none of those threats, anything at all. And now we abducted the president and we have an economic blockade in force, and we're telling them that we're going to take your oil and you got to do this and do that. You need to obey us. So there's no equivalence. There is that attempt to create that, and it's just become sort of like an obvious fact in the minds of so many of the globalists, but it doesn't work.
Well, maybe there will be some type of military alliance in South America after all this, because the way that Trump is talking,
create one.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I would do if I was in South America, because he's openly saying like, yeah, well, we might have to do Colombia or all these countries. We're putting them on watch. We showed you. We'll just go.
Yeah, well, he used cruder language in the case of the Colombian president.
Oh yeah, what did he say exactly?
Yeah, it's like he better watch his ass or something.
Yeah. So there we go, right? I mean, what do you?
And then he repeated it. I mean, it wasn't just once. He came back and he said, "Yeah, he was asked about that," and then he repeated the statement.
Right. So I just, where there's people are celebrating right now, like this is a win. It's going to go south fast. I think it's just not going to go the way we want it, because it never does. When has it ever gone the way we expect it to go? And I just feel like we are triggering a major conflict right now with all these actions. We don't see it right now, but it's just a matter of time. I mean, and it's not just one. I do almost feel like it's coordinated. We got Venezuela, we have the war in Ukraine, and then we'll talk about it around here in a second. But it's just like, well, what do you do when you got $40 trillion in debt? How about 3 wars at the same time? Maybe we'll throw in China. Maybe we'll do 4. That's how I feel like where we're going right now. And so let's move over to Iran, because right now they're entering their 11th day of protest. I'm quite surprised that these protests have been going on so long. I don't know the extent of them, if they're really that extreme or they're being played up here in the Western media to try to warm Trump up to the idea of regime change. Because we were talking about that after the attack by Israel and then the United States on Iran, that there was a sense of unity, that people rallied behind the government and rallied behind the Ayatollah, and for the most part, that seemed to be what happened, and that's why the regime change failed the first time. But,
right.
So what do you make of these protests right now?
Yeah, I wish I knew more, but I don't know a whole lot about what's going on in Iran. I haven't found good sources on that. I need to dig deeper. The protests continue. Again, they're over the economic distress that Iran is suffering, which is really, you have to say, is the result of the sanctions. In particular, their currency lost something like 90% of its value over the last few months. And that has hit in certain sectors of society very hard. Apparently a lot of these shopkeepers and, these people with stalls in the bazaars. And
what triggers a 90% drop like that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just, the demand. I guess it's a fall in exports. There's demand for your currency drops considerably in that case. That's what it comes down to. I mean, currencies are like commodities. It's the value is determined by supply and demand.
But it happened pretty suddenly, like you said. There was
fairly suddenly, and I think after the 12-day war. I don't know and maybe even more recently. So there is an organic cause. There are people that are suffering. Now, I don't even know that the government can, maybe there's, like in the case of Venezuela too, you can say, you point to the sanctions. It's clear that so much of the suffering that the Venezuelans, that you find in Venezuela, is a consequence of the sanctions. This suffering was deliberately created. In fact, the Americans have been quite open about this. We slap on sanctions, we make them hurt, and maybe this will lead to regime change. And I suppose we have to say that, well, the sanctions seem to be working in Iran, right? It is creating dissatisfaction. But I think there's no question. I would be greatly surprised if these these protests aren't being exploited. That we've seen that in the past. We had Mike Pompeo, actually openly stating that there are Mossad agents there. He thought it was a fact that he was celebrating. So you would have hoped that the Iranians had located all these various agents of Israel and of the West within their country following the 12-day war. And I'm sure that they have caught a number of them. A lot of these people exposed themselves during the 12-day war, during the operation, the Mossad-supported operation there. But apparently, anyway, there's that network is still there, and I'm sure that they are doing what they can to exacerbate tensions and increase hostility.
Are you seeing more signs of a regime change incoming? I mean, these protests for me are a clear sign. If they continue, I feel like that's
and maybe it's part of it. It's part of the preparation for war. It could very well be. I think it probably is. There are also reports that American military aircraft are headed towards the Middle East. I don't know. You often hear these things, and sometimes it turns out it's something routine. It's just people, they see the protests, they hear the rhetoric, and then they notice the tankers are coming, and then they assume that it's part of it. And maybe, though, I don't know if these are exceptional flights or not. But anyway, that's been reported.
What's the situation right now within Israel? Are there protests? How's Netanyahu doing? Are they drumming up domestically within Israel the idea of war with Iran? Do you know?
Well, Netanyahu is quite unpopular, and he has his own struggles. He's still trying to hold together his coalition. And it's not clear that he can, but there are many times when it looked like it was curtains for Netanyahu, and then he always seems to pull some kind of magic trick. He is a political genius. He gets himself out of these fixes, so I wouldn't count him out. But it's just like Netanyahu was always there. So, and Netanyahu has always had this obsession with Iran. It's again his desire to truly defeat Iran and to overthrow, its government is, I think, quite sincere that he wants to do this. He wants this to be part of his legacy. But then also he has short-term interests in doing it, right? It's just that he does have a lot of domestic problems. The polls show, again, that his approval ratings are very low. And there are problems even, within his own coalition, especially over the issue of conscription of the ultra-Orthodox. They're part of his coalition, but others in his coalition are not happy with that for obvious reasons. They don't want all the burden of conscription to fall on, their children. So it's just a constant headache, and he's always, in the past, he has used military, conflicts with neighboring states as an excuse for redirecting attention. He's used them to redirect attention, and successfully, it has to be said, in the past. There are many times when some of these problems were coming to a head. It looked like the whole coalition was going to bust apart, or that he was going to be perhaps, sentenced, for corruption, but oh no, we can't do this, in the interest of national security. We have this war with Iran, or this war with Lebanon, or, these operations in Syria. So it's part of an ongoing saga. We've seen it before, and I think we're seeing it again.
It's so crazy. What do you think where we're heading? War with Iran, likely. A wider war in Venezuela, likely. Taking Greenland, likely. Direct confrontation with Russia. I just feel like it's all happening now.
Yeah, right. It's all possible, Again, it's just like Trump has shown he hasn't committed, he still hasn't gone to the boots on the ground. Now, he said in the case of Venezuela that he was willing to do it. That's the first, and I think that was a shift. He has so far limited himself to these dramatic, operations that play very well on TV and play well to his base. Talking about Midnight Hammer in Iran, or what was it, Operation Absolute Resolve, the abduction of Maduro in Venezuela. And so it seems to me, again, that's how he would like to keep things. If he can work something out with the Israelis where, there's Operation Midnight Hammer 2, maybe directed against the Iranian missile program, you go in and out, and it's done, and another great victory, another mission accomplished moment. Yeah, I think that would be his preference. But again, in the case of Iran, it's just not that simple. Again, Iran can strike back. They're much stronger than Venezuela is, and there are a lot of juicy targets for them. And just very recently, again, the Iranian government has said that, yeah, we'll hit those targets. They have been saying you were going to hit back real hard, and they even said quite recently, I think it was their newly formed defense council, stated that we may not wait for the Israelis to strike us. If we see they're about to strike us, instead of just letting them hit us first like they did last time, we will strike first. They actually said we're at least they have leaving that as an option, that is something that they would consider doing and that they might really do.
It's a scary world. I just feel like I hope we can make it through 2026. We're at this point now as well, though. I feel your countries like Russia and China have been trying to really closely calibrate their responses to the United States. And I used this metaphor before, like the U.S. is this deranged mental patient, and, the rest of the world needs to act like orderlies to make sure that he doesn't hurt anybody, but you have to kind of humor him. But I think we've gone past that. We're at this point now that the orderlies need to stand up. Somebody needs to stand up to the United States at some point, because we're emboldening Trump every time that he does one of these actions and he seizes a tanker, he decapitates a country or kidnaps Maduro, whatever. At some point, I think we're at this point now where countries need to stand up, and the two countries that really can do it are China and Russia. And these have been labeled directly as adversaries of the United States, and we've explicitly said that they're not allowed to have economic interest in our hemisphere, that this is our part of the world. And, we got to buy Greenland because we can't have Russian and Chinese Navy vessels going around there. So I think these countries will have to stand up. And then that's just so terrifying because we're talking about superpower war. We've never had that before. We've never had this. During the Cold War, were we seizing like vessels from the Soviet Union?
No. Actually, again, there were, for example, even understanding in the within the Western Hemisphere after the Cuban Missile Crisis, or it was actually part of what the agreement that resolved the Cuban Missile Crisis, including an understanding that, okay, well, first of all, the U.S. will not attack Cuba again, but also Russia will not support revolutionary movements within Latin America. And they say, okay, we'll do that. And that's, both sides kept to it, for the longest time. And in general, there were red lines that were respected, throughout the Cold War. And you could see it, for example, when the Czechs rose up in 1968, the Americans did not intervene. There was something like, okay, we don't like this. We hope that the democratic movement in Czechoslovakia succeeds, but this is a Soviet affair, and they stayed out, and that's just the way it was. And that has clearly changed. I mean, it's just I think it changed really as a result, well, obviously changed as a result of the fall of the Soviet Union and especially the very weak state that Russia found itself in the 1990s and into the early 2000s. And and during that time, that very healthy caution that we had evaporated. And now, these red lines are not being respected, and we're in a new situation, a very dangerous one, because it's just Russian weakness has allowed the U.S. to become reckless. I'll just give you an example. Like there was the 91 drones that when it flew into Novgorod, and again, shortly thereafter, we got that long article in the New York Times about very direct CIA involvement in drone attacks. We don't know for a fact that the CIA was involved in this, but you'd have every reason to suspect that they were. And again, the Russians say that it was directed at Putin's residence. And it was, later the CIA, that was denied and completely. But then the CIA did confirm that, yeah, there was an attack into Novgorod, to some place not terribly far from his residence. And they never named that place. But
they never named the target.
Yeah, right, exactly. Which Alexander Mercouris, I think, very rightly points out that that's a cause for tremendous suspicion because there's no reason not to name the target. Everybody's going to know, where these facilities are. So why, if you can't name the target, maybe the target didn't exist. The target was, in fact, the Valdai residence. But just stop and think for a second. It's like, that is rather alarming. But the fact that the whole world isn't up in arms tells you how things have changed. Just again, put the shoe on the other foot here, and again, just think about a similar attack carried out by the Russians on, let's say, southern Florida, and the drones were heading from Cuba to Mar-a-Lago, 91, and fortunately they're all shot down, and the Russians said, well, okay, we weren't actually after Mar-a-Lago, it was someplace nearby. And would we just shrug our shoulders? Would we just, again, that could be a casus belli. That could be the beginning of World War III. But we just got in the habit, like we just have this sense of invulnerability, and there's this real recklessness on our part. And it's becoming increasingly dangerous. The Russians and the Chinese are put in a difficult position, right? They always have this choice. Okay, do we respond firmly? But with this new government, it's not just Trump, but it is partly his personality. It's just this global hegemon. How will we respond? We don't want World War III, right? But at the same time, if we don't make it clear, that things are going to get worse, and eventually, we will end up in World War III. So you're just sort of damned if you do and damned if you don't.
Yeah, well, we're acting with impunity because there's no consequences of it from what we do. We can cross red line after red line after red line, and nothing seems to happen. And so as long as that's why eventually, though, there will be a reaction, a firm reaction, and then we'll walk away with a bloody nose, and then, we won't walk away. Then it'll be a catastrophic war,
Right.
And
right. Well, the thing is, it has to be pointed out that there have been responses on the Russian side. They're not really of a tit for tat nature, but first of all, you have to look at the launch of the SMO. I mean, that was something, a red line was crossed, and the Russians were saying, hey, this is really serious. Hey, but it went on for years, but eventually they did in a big way, right? They responded in a big way. And then they actually doubled down on it. At first it wasn't about territory at all. And now it has become about territory, and they've made that quite clear, right? So they do respond, but they do in their own fashion and, in a way that they think actually defends their own interests. But it isn't sufficient to, it should be a wake-up call and say, well, this was a big mistake. This didn't work out, and now.
But the responses, they're not so much against the United States, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they go against our proxy. They never, and they still have this whole idea that, maybe not anymore, but that somehow we're mediating with the United States, even though the United States is the one that's orchestrating all
Yeah,
this.
well,
And
the
somehow,
Russians know that, what the Americans are doing, but they
but then
have
why have the pretense if when you
right.
rush the U.S. is now directly seizing your ships? Like
Yeah, right. No, it's right. Yeah, well, a lot of people in Russia are asking the same question. Again, I think I presented what I believe may be Putin's position, which is that, okay, yeah, he knows that this is a pretense. He knows that these negotiations aren't going anywhere. But he knows that there will never be a settlement through them. He knows that it is a charade, right? He knows all that. But at the same time, it doesn't help them to enrage Trump and actually to be on his good side. As long as Trump hates the Ukrainians more than he hates the Russians, that's good for us. And there's some evidence of that. I mean, there has been, I know that the lion's share of support continues to flow to Ukraine, through various means. But there has been a cutback. The fact that the U.S. is pretty much cut off the direct line of supplies is hurting them. And, I believe so. I mean, this mechanism that the Europeans have set up, it's bound to fail. The Europeans just don't have the money, and then again, you have this collective action program. You say, well, let the Germans shoulder it. We don't want to chip in our share. Because the EU just is not a real country, and they can't actually force the different governments to cough up the money that's necessary. And so there has been a real reduction in aid. And there are limits to the European ability to support this cause. And I'm sure the Russians are looking at that and saying, this arrangement, we'll never get a settlement, but this new arrangement that exists between the Europeans and the Americans is really to our advantage, not really even in the long run, but probably in the short or the medium term. We're already seeing the effects of it, and those effects are going to become increasingly obvious over the next few months.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, before we end it today, Dad, you mentioned before the podcast that you wanted to talk about White Rex a bit. So do you want to finish with that?
Very quickly. Yeah, White Rex is back from the dead. That's the first thing that has to be said. I mentioned that he had been assassinated or killed by a drone somewhere around Guliopole. Apparently, he was not killed. It was a staged death. And the Ukrainians are boasting that they tricked the Russians. The Russians had paid off somebody who they believed was an agent of theirs within Ukraine. It was supposed to be 500,000 rubles, which would be something over $5,000. So it's not a huge amount of money. So he's back. He's still there. He's still in Ukraine. But it doesn't change anything that I said about him. He's the same White Rex. He's the same advocate of mass violence. He is the same supporter of Tarrant, the perpetrator of the Christchurch massacre. An obsessive kind of celebrant of his massacre. His group, the Russian Volunteer Corps that he leads, is still there. And it must be said, these are not cuddly neo-Nazis. A lot of them are Satanists. That's not an actual, an exaggeration. These are the kind of people who actually celebrate killing for its own sake. There's some group called, I think it's the Maniacs Cult of Murder. And they're they're associated with them, and then with the Nationalist Socialist White Power that also it does the same sort of things. So this is the same group. So that's what we're talking about, the Russian Volunteer Corps. Now, the thing what I learned recently that I really stunned me was that they're like the two main funders of this Russian Volunteer Corps are Jewish oligarchs, one of whom lives in the UK, the other lives in Tel Aviv. And this one in Tel Aviv, his name right now escapes me, is actually a co-owner and a board member of Haaretz, the leftist newspaper in Israel, the only real leftist newspaper, the one at the far left of the spectrum in Israel. He is a major funder and advocate, for the Russian Volunteer Corps, which I found just quite extraordinary. And both of these figures, I think it's Kolomoisky is the one, the oligarch in the UK. He's also a funder and a major supporter of the Russian Volunteer Corps. They're very important in the Russian emigre community, the anti-Putin, community. And within that community, there is something at a debate. There are people that, and groups there that condemn the Russian Volunteer Corps and say we shouldn't have anything to do with them. Including, like, for example, Media Zona, which we mentioned earlier. So, this is, you have to respect them for that. They're principled. And in general, I think the followers of Navalny and the organization, that the anti-corruption organization that he created, in general, they are they point their finger at White Rex and say, this is who he is. We cannot support this guy. But they appear to be losing this fight within the Russian emigre community, which I find quite extraordinary. It's just because there's very powerful support for White Rex and the Russian volunteer community. And then again, we saw it like after his death, there was, I mentioned there were gushing obituaries. So, one of them was from Garry Kasparov, who's the chess champion. And he's, an anti-Putin fanatic. And again, part of that Russian emigre community. He spoke, in the glowing terms of the heroic death of White Rex. This is what we see. So I just find that, we've talked about that, like within Ukraine, okay, like within the Russian emigre community, at least there's a split, but it seems like actually the supporters of these extreme, really fanatical, nationalists. I want to emphasize, like we hear about the far right or whatever in Europe or America. It's generally just total nonsense, what they label as the far right. But these people are for real. These are people that really advocate mass violence, and sometimes just for its own sake. And within Ukraine, it's a very cozy relationship now between the so-called liberal nationalists, the Western-oriented liberals, and these kind of the band rights and the neo-Nazis. It's a very, very cozy relationship. And I think the reason, one reason that came about is that these people understood that these ultra-nationalists are the only ones that are going to do the real fighting. They're not going to, the liberals aren't going to, but they will. So so starting with the Maidan coup, and then afterwards the beginning of the civil war in eastern Ukraine, they quickly realized that they were not going to be able to carry out their plans. The liberals were not going to be able to carry out the plans without these ultra-nationalists. So they have become very, very close. And, they lionize them. And then you see the same tendency within the Russian emigre community, too. And then I was just a thought kind of popped up in my mind. And it may, in the end, prove to be nothing, and lead to nothing. But I was struck by maybe the similarity of the position of so many of the Western leaders. You have these globalists that are just fanatically anti-Putin, that are just itching for war with Russia, it seems. We talk about Keir Starmer and Meretz and Macron, again, the three leaders of the three largest countries in Europe, not the EU, but in Europe. We've also, you can see they're itching for war, but they don't really have willing soldiers. Their people do not support them, and that's their great weakness. Now, White Rex has gone ahead and he's established other Russian volunteer corps in different countries, in Belarus, in Germany, in Poland. And they're tiny now, they're quite small, but they exist. And just the thought came, it's like, well, we start to see this whole phenomenon spread. Again, we have these liberal elites who want war, but are unable to fight it. But they'll find the soldiers they can find. And if it starts to, they come out of the ultra-nationalist or, neo-Nazi community, they'll be fine with it. That's what they've proven to us. So again, it's very fringe, that may never happen, but stranger things have happened. The movements that have changed history come out of the fringes. So I think it at least bears watching. It's something that we should watch and see if it develops further.
Mm-hmm. Well, why would Ukraine stage White Rex's death anyways? What did they get out of staging his death? Nothing, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, and maybe just to embarrass the Russians, or they said actually maybe to expose certain people in their network. That was stated. I don't know. They watched to see how different people responded, but yeah, apparently he clearly is alive, and this was after his death had been mourned, in kind of typical torchlit fashion across the world. And again, he is a global figure within the neo-Nazi movement.
And why would liberal Jewish oligarchs be funding him?
Yeah,
What is it that there's some weird connection with Israel and Ukraine? And I know we have this discussion sometimes. They say, well, it's really not in Israel's interest to have the war in Ukraine going because that means less resources for Israel to do war with Iran or whatever it is. But there does seem to be some type of connection. And I know that many people in Israel are from Ukraine, from Eastern Europe. There's a huge percentage. I feel like.
Well, it also goes the other way. I mean, you look at the leadership in Ukraine, that a lot of it is Jewish. Zelensky, Yermak, Mindich, who was known as Zelensky's wallet. He didn't have an official position, but he was the one with the golden toilet. He's now in Tel Aviv. So yeah, I mean, there are these connections. I think, like in the case of the Jewish oligarchs supporting the Russian Volunteer Corps, it's just their fanatical hatred of Russia and, particularly Russian government and Putin, and that's what drives them.
Yeah, people sometimes claim that I'm seeing Israel in my coffee, which, I know maybe sometimes they're going too far down these rabbit holes, but it just kind of feels a bit that, Israel isn't in this existential battle. I think they know that the writing's on the wall, and really the only way out for them is to have an all-out war, and the sooner they do it, the better, because the balance of power is shifting away from the U.S. hegemon, right? So it just feels like if they want war, and and the scary thing is that it seems like you can get a handful of really, really powerful, wealthy people, and they can make it happen. They can make that war happen. So ultimately, it's like, okay, well, let's do this. We're going to do it all out brawl. We'll hope we come out on top, and then we'll maintain our dominance. Because people want to get all conspiratorial with Jewish power, but it's just true. You just see that throughout. I mean, we just talked about with Ukraine and within this country everywhere. So, where does the real decision making get made? Is it Israel? I think a lot of it is.
Yeah. Right. Well, I mean, there are obviously these connections, and we just discussed some of them, which nobody can deny. It seems like, again, I would still say that it appears to me that, U.S. commitment to this proxy war in Ukraine is not in Israel's interest. Maybe there's something I'm missing. Maybe they really are thinking in terms of World War III or whatever. But I'll stick with that position, though.
Well, I made the argument before, and I'll make it again. I think it is in their interest, because if the West loses in Ukraine, it means that U.S. hegemony is over. Without U.S. hegemony, Israel can't survive. That we will have entered in the multipolar world. The unipolar moment is officially done. And then that way the Israel project will die with it. They need for the United States to win, to be dominant, in the world. And then that means, beating, maybe they didn't want this war. They don't like where it's going now, but the way it is now, they have to make sure that the United States wins,
Well, it must be said that is basically the neocon thinking, and again, neoconservatism grows out of the Jewish community, and particularly in New York, the Trotskyite community, and the support for neoconservatism, I think, from outside of that community, because, obviously you can't equate neoconservatism with the Jewish community. There are a lot of Gentile supporters, but a lot of those Gentile supporters liked, what they saw Israel doing. They liked their, gloves off approach. And I think maybe that's one reason why we're starting to see what we're seeing in American foreign policy is, so that there, anyway, I guess I should get right to the point here. It says for the neoconservatives, they believe strongly in American power. And part of the reason that they believe in American power is they see it as a protection for Israel. And so, yeah, American power must be unchallenged. American power cannot be diminished. So, yeah, I mean, I guess that thinking does exist, and it may be motivating some of these very strange alliances that we see.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like we're heading to war, Dad. I just feel it in my bones. It's scary.
Well, I wish I could say don't worry, but I'm worried.
Okay, we'll end it there. Yeah, if you made it to the end, like this conversation, please consider subscribing. I'm trying to make this podcast a full-time thing down the road. I'm really busy. I have a lot of things going on, and so if I'm able to do that, that would be amazing. So if you're able to support, click the subscribe button, and we also have a Substack that you can go do. And if you're able to give more, then that, of course, it's very much appreciated. Okay, all right, thanks a bunch. I'll talk to you soon, Dad.
Okay.
Merry Christmas to all Eastern
Thank
Orthodox.
you. Yes, Merry Christmas.
Okay, bye-bye.